The Book Essence Podcast, Ep.19, Digital Gold, Part 2.
All right, welcome back. Ready for part 2 of our deep dive into this crazy world of Bitcoin. Last time, we left off with the Silk Road getting shut down, and you'd think that'd be the end of Bitcoin, right? Like, who would want to touch it after that?
You'd think so, yeah, but that's where things get interesting.
But instead of crashing and burning, Bitcoin kind of took a left turn.
It did. It went from being that shady money on the dark web to something so much better.
So imagine it's 2013, Silk Road's this online black market making millions with Bitcoin, right? And then, boom, the FBI shows up, arrests the founder, the whole thing shuts down. You'd think everyone would just run away from Bitcoin after that.
Totally. You'd think that would scare everyone off. But
Right.
here's the thing. The shutdown kind of backfired.
What do you mean?
Well, instead of scaring people away, it actually brought more attention to Bitcoin.
So it's like all the bad press actually helped Bitcoin.
It's kind of ironic, right? The shutdown was like this huge wake-up call, not just for the authorities, but for investors, entrepreneurs, everyone.
So it's like everyone suddenly realized, hey, this Bitcoin thing is actually a big deal.
Right. It wasn't just some fringe technology anymore. It was a phenomenon.
But who were the people who saw this potential? The ones who really drove this change?
Well, there were some unexpected players who entered the scene.
Like who?
Well, get this, the Winklevoss twins.
Oh, wow, those guys.
Yeah.
The Facebook guys, right.
Yeah, exactly.
So they decided to jump on the Bitcoin bandwagon.
Well, it was more than just jumping on the bandwagon. Their involvement was a huge deal.
Yeah, I mean, they're not exactly known for being, like, risk-averse.
No, not at all. And that's why their support for Bitcoin was so significant.
So they were basically putting their reputation on the line for this new, untested technology.
And their money. They invested millions, called Bitcoin the next gold. Even tried to launch a Bitcoin ETF.
Hold on, a Bitcoin ETF. What's that?
It's a way to make Bitcoin more accessible to everyday investors. Think of it like buying stocks.
So instead of buying Apple or Google, you'd be buying a piece of Bitcoin.
Exactly. It's like buying shares of a company, but the company is Bitcoin itself.
That's pretty wild. So the Winklevoss twins were trying to make Bitcoin as mainstream as buying stocks.
They saw it as a way to legitimize Bitcoin and bring it into the world of traditional finance.
So they were like pioneers, trying to pave the way for Bitcoin's future.
You could say that. They saw the potential for Bitcoin to disrupt the financial industry.
And they weren't alone, were they?
No, Silicon Valley was also taking notice. Big names like Marc Andreessen were becoming Bitcoin believers.
Marc Andreessen, that's a huge name in tech, right?
Absolutely. He's like a legend in Silicon Valley. He co-founded Netscape. He's a big-time venture capitalist.
So if he's getting involved, you know it's got to be something serious.
Exactly. And his firm, Andreessen Horowitz, invested heavily in Bitcoin startups.
Wait, so the same people who were funding the next Facebook or Uber were now betting on Bitcoin?
Yeah, they saw it as this revolutionary technology with the potential to change the world.
And they were willing to put their money where their mouth was. But what about the price of Bitcoin? Did all this hype actually translate into real value?
Oh, yeah, big time. In late 2013, Bitcoin's price went through the roof.
Really? How high did it go?
It exceeded $1,000 for the first time ever.
Wow, $1,000. That's crazy.
I know, right? From being worth pennies to being more valuable than an ounce of gold. It was a wild time.
So this is when Bitcoin finally went mainstream, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everyone started using it for their everyday purchases.
No, not quite.
Why not? What was stopping it?
There was still some major hurdles to overcome. One of the biggest was trust.
Trust, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, this was still a new technology, right? Not everyone was convinced.
Right. And then there was the whole issue of security. Remember, this is money we're talking about,
All right.
and people need to know that their funds are safe.
Yeah, and speaking of security, the source material mentions Mt. Gox.
Yeah.
And, well, that's a name that makes a lot of early Bitcoin adopters cringe.
It does. It's a cautionary tale, a reminder of how things can go wrong.
So tell me, what happened there? Why is Mt. Gox such a big deal in Bitcoin history?
Mt. Gox was this Japanese Bitcoin exchange, and it became the biggest player in the market.
So it was like the go-to place to buy and sell Bitcoin.
Pretty much. They were handling over 70% of all Bitcoin trades.
Whoa, that's a lot of power for one company to have.
It was, and unfortunately, they weren't prepared for it.
What do you mean?
Well, behind the scenes, Mt. Gox was a mess. They had all these technical issues, security vulnerabilities.
So it's like this giant house of cards just waiting to collapse.
And in early 2014, it did.
What happened?
Mt. Gox suddenly halted all withdrawals, claiming technical difficulties.
Uh-oh, that doesn't sound good.
It wasn't. Turns out they had lost a huge amount of Bitcoin.
How much are we talking about?
850,000 Bitcoins.
850,000. That's insane. What happened to all that Bitcoin?
Gone. Vanished into thin air.
And what about the people who had their money on Mt. Gox?
They lost everything. Thousands of people wiped out.
That's devastating. It must have been a huge blow to Bitcoin's reputation.
It was. People started questioning whether Bitcoin could ever be trusted.
I can only imagine. So after a disaster like that, did governments finally decide to step in? Did they start trying to regulate Bitcoin?
They did. The Mt. Gox collapse, along with Bitcoin's growing popularity, forced governments to take notice. The question was, how do you regulate something that's designed to be decentralized and uncontrollable?
Right, that's the dilemma, isn't it?
Exactly, and it sparked a huge debate within the Bitcoin community, dividing people into two camps.
Two camps, like what?
On one side, you had the libertarians, the cypherpunks, the people who believe in Bitcoin's original vision, freedom from government control.
They saw regulation as a threat, right?
They did. They felt like it went against the whole point of Bitcoin.
But what about the other side?
On the other side were the pragmatists, the ones who believed that some level of regulation was necessary for Bitcoin to really succeed.
So they thought that some rules were needed to make Bitcoin more mainstream.
Yeah, they argued that clear rules would attract more investors and make people feel more confident about using Bitcoin.
So it was a battle between ideology and practicality.
Absolutely, a battle for the very soul of Bitcoin.
And that's where we'll pick things up next time. This is getting really interesting.
It is, and it's only going to get more intense from here.
So make sure you join us for the next part of our deep dive into the history of Bitcoin. We'll be exploring how Bitcoin navigated this tension between freedom and regulation.
And how a new wave of startups and technologies emerged to shape its future.
Until then, keep exploring and keep those brains buzzing.
We'll see you next time.
Okay, so we're back, and things are really starting to heat up in the Bitcoin world. Last time, we were talking about that clash between the Bitcoin purists, those who want to keep it completely free from any kind of regulation, and then the others who believe that some rules, at least a few, are actually needed for Bitcoin to really take off and become, I don't know, like a legitimate thing.
Yeah, it's almost like a classic showdown, like the rebels versus the establishment.
Exactly. So where do we go from there?
Well, in the middle of all of that, there's another story unfolding, and it's the rise of Silicon Valley and the role that they play in shaping Bitcoin's future.
Right. We talked about how all those venture capitalists were pouring money into Bitcoin startups. But were those startups really trying to, I don't know, change the world, or were they just chasing profits? I mean, come on, Silicon Valley's not exactly known for, being altruistic.
Well, that's a really good point, and Silicon Valley does have that reputation, right, being driven by profit and disruption. But I think with Bitcoin, there was this genuine belief, at least among many, that this technology had the power to, I don't know, democratize finance, to empower individuals, to create a system that was more equitable. Of course, making money was definitely part of it, but I think there was also a real sense of idealism.
So it's like they saw this opportunity to maybe get rich while also, I don't know, shaking things up a bit.
Exactly, and you can see that reflected in the types of companies that were emerging at that time. So there's Coinbase, like we talked about earlier. They were focused on making it easier for everyday people to buy and sell Bitcoin. Creating this user-friendly platform, almost like the Amazon of Bitcoin.
Makes sense. You can't expect everyone to be a tech genius.
Right, exactly.
But what about the people who actually wanted to spend Bitcoin? Were there any companies focused on that side of things?
Oh, absolutely. So you have companies like BitPay, and they were all about making it easier for businesses to accept Bitcoin payments, bridging that gap between the crypto world and traditional commerce. Imagine being able to buy your coffee with Bitcoin.
That would be pretty cool. But did that actually happen? Did Bitcoin become like a mainstream payment method back then?
Not quite. I mean, while those startups made a lot of progress in making Bitcoin easier to use, that mass adoption, it was still pretty far off.
Okay, so what was holding it back? Was it just a matter of getting more people to use it?
It was more than that, actually. A big obstacle was that regulatory uncertainty that we were talking about earlier. Governments were still trying to figure out, like, how to classify Bitcoin, how to regulate businesses that were operating in this
It's
space.
like the Wild West out there.
Exactly. And it created a lot of headaches for those startups who were just trying to navigate this totally new legal landscape.
Yeah, it must be hard to build a business when you don't even know what the rules are.
It was. And then on top of that, you still had that issue of security, especially after the whole Mt. Gox disaster.
Yeah, those security breaches were a big problem, weren't they? It seems like even with all the technological advancements, Bitcoin was still pretty vulnerable to hackers.
It was, unfortunately. And those security breaches really hurt Bitcoin's reputation. Every time there was a big hack, it made headlines, and it just reinforced that perception that Bitcoin was risky. It wasn't reliable.
I bet that was frustrating for the people who were working so hard to, build this new system, this better system.
Yeah.
Did it affect Bitcoin's growth?
It did, definitely. It made people hesitant to trust Bitcoin, to trust it with their money. And it also fueled those calls for more regulation. You had governments and financial institutions that were getting really worried about the potential for money laundering and all sorts of other illegal activities.
Yeah, I can see how that would happen. So it's like Bitcoin was caught in this, I don't know, this weird cycle where it needed to grow to succeed, but that growth made it a target for all the wrong reasons.
Exactly. And that's a tension that still exists today. How do you balance freedom and decentralization with the need for security and some kind of legitimacy?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. And it's a question that the Bitcoin community is still wrestling with today.
It's like a constant push and pull trying to find that sweet spot.
Right. And while all of that was happening, Bitcoin was also facing some serious technical challenges. Remember how we talked about the limited block size? Well, as Bitcoin became more popular, the network started to get really congested.
So it's like a highway with too many cars, right? Everyone's trying to get somewhere, but everything's just slowed to a crawl.
Exactly. Transactions were taking longer and fees were going up. It was becoming harder to use Bitcoin, especially for everyday things.
So what could they do about it? Was there any way to fix that?
Well, remember how we were talking about those big blockers earlier? They wanted to just make the blocks bigger to allow for more transactions.
Right, but the small blockers were worried about that, weren't they?
They were. They thought it would compromise Bitcoin's decentralization. So it was this whole debate about, what's more important, speed or security.
So what happened? Did they just argue about it forever?
Well, this is the Bitcoin world we're talking about. These are people who are driven by problem solving, so they started looking for new solutions. And one of the most promising developments was something called the Lightning Network.
The Lightning Network, okay. What's that all about?
It's actually pretty cool. It's like a second layer that's built on top of the main Bitcoin blockchain, and it allows for faster and cheaper transactions by moving them off of that main blockchain.
So it's like creating a separate lane for Bitcoin transactions.
Yeah, exactly. It's like building those express lanes on a highway, so some cars can bypass all the traffic.
Okay, I get it.
Yeah.
So the Lightning Network helps speed things up and keep the fees down.
That's the idea. It was a major step forward in making Bitcoin more practical for everyday use.
Sounds promising. Did it solve all of Bitcoin's problems?
Well, not all of them. The Lightning Network was still new, and there were definitely some challenges, some technical limitations. But it was a great example of how the Bitcoin community is always looking for ways to improve things.
It's like they're constantly pushing the envelope, trying to find better ways to do things.
Exactly. And that's really what makes Bitcoin so interesting. It's this constantly evolving technology, and it's driven by a community that's passionate about making it work.
But even with all that innovation, there were still some roadblocks, right?
Yeah, definitely. Remember, the source material mentioned that there were still those security issues and scandals, things that were just plaguing the industry.
Right. Even with all the cool tech stuff, Bitcoin was still vulnerable to hackers and scams.
It was, and those security breaches kept happening. And every time one did, it was all over the news. It made people question Bitcoin's security all over again.
It must have been frustrating for the Bitcoin community, to keep seeing these things happening.
Yeah.
Especially when they were working so hard to build this new system that was supposed to be more secure.
It was, and it definitely slowed down adoption. People were hesitant to trust Bitcoin, especially with their money. And, it gave more fuel to those calls for regulation. Governments and financial institutions were worried about all the potential for illegal activities, and it made them want to step in and, take control.
So it was like Bitcoin was stuck between a rock and a hard place. It needed to grow to succeed, but that growth just made it a bigger target for all the wrong reasons.
Exactly, and it's a tension that still exists today. It's this balance between freedom and security, between innovation and regulation. It's a question that the Bitcoin community and really the whole world is still grappling with.
That's a great point. It's like we're all trying to figure out how to navigate this new world, this world where technology is changing everything so fast.
Exactly, and Bitcoin is right at the forefront of that change. It's a fascinating story, and it's a story that's still being written.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, where do we go from here? What's the next chapter in this Bitcoin saga? That's something we could delve into more next time. But for now, I think it's safe to say that we've both learned a lot from this deep dive into the history of Bitcoin.
We have. It's been an incredible journey so far, and it's amazing to see how much Bitcoin has already accomplished, despite all those challenges.
It's a testament to the power of ideas and to the people who believe in them. And to all of you listening out there, keep exploring, keep learning, because in the world of cryptocurrency, anything is possible.
That's right, and we'll see you next time for the final part of our deep dive.
So it's kind of like Bitcoin was becoming a victim of its own success, right? Like it was getting so popular that it was starting to clog up the system.
Yeah, it's like, that really trendy restaurant that everyone wants to go to.
And then the wait times are like 2 hours.
Exactly. It gets so popular that no one can even get a table.
So what do? Do you just tell people to stop coming?
Well, no, you try to find a way to, expand, right, or come up with a more efficient system.
And that's kind of what Bitcoin had to do too, right?
Right. They needed to find ways to scale up to handle all of those new users.
Okay, so how did they do that? I remember we talked about those big blockers who wanted to just make the blocks bigger so they could fit more transactions. But then there were the small blockers who were like, no way, that's going to mess everything up.
Right. They were worried about sacrificing decentralization for speed, remember?
Yeah, so what happened? Did they just keep arguing about it while the whole system ground to a halt?
No, they kept working on solutions. And one of the most promising things that came out of that was something called the Lightning Network.
Lightning Network? Okay, what is that?
It's pretty cool, actually. It's like the second layer that's built on top of the Bitcoin blockchain, and it allows for faster and cheaper transactions by moving them off the main blockchain.
Okay, so imagine you've got this highway, and it's totally jammed with traffic, right?
Right.
And the Lightning Network is like building a whole new set of express lanes that run alongside the main highway, so some cars can just zip right through without getting stuck in all the traffic.
Exactly. That's a great analogy.
So it's like a fast track for Bitcoin transactions.
You got it. And because it's off the main blockchain, it can handle a lot more transactions much faster and cheaper.
So did that, solve all of Bitcoin's problems?
Well, it was a huge step forward, but it wasn't perfect. The Lightning Network, it was still pretty new, and there were still some technical challenges. But it was a great example of how the Bitcoin community, they're always coming up with innovative solutions.
It's like they're not afraid to experiment, right? To try new things.
Exactly. And that's what's so exciting about Bitcoin. It's always evolving.
But even with all that innovation, there were still those other challenges, right? Like the security stuff we were talking about.
Right. The hacks and the scams, those things just kept happening.
It's like they were building this amazing high-tech car, but they forgot to put in an alarm system.
Oh, yeah. That's a good way to put it. And those security breaches, they really hurt Bitcoin's reputation. Every time there was a big hack, it made headlines. And it just made people think that Bitcoin was risky and unreliable.
And I bet that was frustrating, for all the people who were working so hard to make Bitcoin better.
It was, and it definitely slowed down adoption. People were just scared to trust Bitcoin with their money, and, it gave more ammunition to those who were calling for more regulation.
So it's like Bitcoin was trapped.
Yeah.
Right. It needed to grow to succeed, but that growth also made it a target.
Yeah, and that's a tension that still exists today. It's this balance between freedom and security, between innovation and regulation, and it's something that the whole world is trying to figure out, not just the Bitcoin community.
That's a great point. It's like Bitcoin is this microcosm of all the challenges that we're facing in this digital age.
It is, and it's what makes it so fascinating to study.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the history of Bitcoin, from its humble beginnings to, all those wild swings and those epic battles.
We have. It's been quite a ride.
And I think we've both learned a lot about this incredible technology, and I'm sure the story is far from over.
No, it's definitely not. Bitcoin is still evolving, and who knows what the future holds.
That's the exciting part. And to everyone listening out there, keep exploring, keep learning, because in the world of cryptocurrency, anything is possible.
Absolutely. And thanks for joining us on this deep dive.